Today, I am announcing the normalization of diplomatic relationships with Vietnam.
Aloha, and thank you for joining us for the third session of the United States-Vietnam Indo-Pacific Conversation Series, organized in partnership with the University of Social Sciences and Humanities, Vietnam National University, Ho Chi Minh City, and with generous support from the U.S. Department of State through the U.S. Consulate in Ho Chi Minh City. My name is Ariel Stenek, and I'm the director of Pacific Forum's Young Leaders Program. In the previous session of this series, we discussed maritime security, an issue area that has brought Hanoi and Washington even closer together. And as the US and Vietnam celebrate 25 years of diplomatic relations, we continue to deepen ties between our two countries and explore new areas for collaboration. But unique to this bilateral relationship are historical issues that, despite significant reconciliation efforts on both sides, remain contentious and have the potential to hinder progress in future bilateral cooperation. Today's session, titled From Foes to Friends, Rethinking US-Vietnam Reconciliation, will reflect on these heavy war legacies. In 1995, Vietnam released an official estimate of fatalities in the Vietnam War, which counts as many as 2 million civilians and some 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. The US military has estimated some 81,832 US soldiers were either killed or have been missing in action. As one of the costliest and most controversial foreign military campaigns in the history of the United States, the Vietnam War left deep scars on America's collective consciousness. As a student who learned about the war almost 30 years after it ended, one of my guides was the author Tim O'Brien, a Vietnam War veteran whose novel, The Things They Carried, is a staple in grade school curriculum across the United States. To quote O'Brien, "The very facts were shrouded in uncertainty. Was it a civil war, a war of national liberation, or simple aggression? Who started it, and when, and why? What really happened to the USS Maddox on that dark night in the Gulf of Tonkin? Was Ho Chi Minh a communist stooge, or a nationalist savior, or both, or neither? What about the Geneva Accords? What about SEATO and the Cold War? What about dominoes? America was divided on these and 1,000 other issues, and the debate had spilled out across the floor of the United States Senate and into the streets, and smart men in pinstripes could not agree on even the most fundamental matters of public policy. The only certainty that summer was moral confusion." Then, as now, the reasons as to why America was engaged in Vietnam remain murky and controversial. Our intent today is to revisit two important Vietnam War legacies: the recovery of the remains of Americans missing in action and the use of Agent Orange in conflict. These are without a doubt sensitive matters, but since 1995, the people of the United States and Vietnam have dedicated themselves to bridging the gaps in their respective perceptions of the war and worked tirelessly to turn this mutual understanding into actionable policy priorities. While the reconciliation process has not been easy, it has achieved significant breakthroughs thanks to their efforts and continued dialogue. Today, we are joined by two experts who will revisit mutual efforts to overcome history, promote transitional justice and people-to-people ties, and achieve enduring US-Vietnam partnership. Dr. Denise To is a supervisor and laboratory manager for the US Department of Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, also known as DPAA. She is board certified by the American Board of Forensic Anthropology and a member of the Register of Professional Archaeologists. She has been an archaeologist for 27 years, which includes excavation of pyramids at Teotihuacan, mass graves in central Mexico, and ancient human fossils in South Africa. In addition to teaching at Arizona State University, she has worked across Europe, Latin America, Asia, Oceania, and South Africa, and took part in recovery efforts following mass disasters in Nepal and in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina. She's currently the functional area manager for all archaeological science conducted on all of DPAA's field operations around the world to recover the human remains of missing US military personnel. Mr. Phan is a graduate research assistant at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies and is currently researching the impact that wartime reconciliation efforts related to Agent Orange compensation have had on the US-Vietnam relationship today. His research interests also include Vietnam's foreign policy, Vietnam's relations with great and middle powers, international relations of the Asia-Pacific, and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. Phan is also a member of Pacific Forum's United States Vietnam Next Generation Leaders Initiative that is conducting research in conjunction with this virtual seminar series. Before I turn the floor to our speakers, just some disclaimers. The views expressed by the speakers and myself as moderator do not necessarily reflect the views and official positions of the US Department of State, the US Consulate in Ho Chi Minh City, or the United States government. All views and opinions expressed in this webinar also do not necessarily reflect the positions of Pacific Forum or of the speaker's home institutions. Finally, all remarks, including those during the question and answer portion, are on the record. So as a reminder, we are live and not just on the Zoom platform, but also on Facebook. So please be mindful of that. Each speaker will have 12 minutes to present, and after their presentations, we will open the floor to the audience for feedback and questions. Without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first guest speaker in Honolulu. Dr. To, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Xin chào, everybody. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you very much. And I do want to thank Ariel and Dr. Ordeniel for the opportunity to participate tonight. I'm pretty excited about it. Let me turn over the screen for a second. All righty. Two little disclaimers before we begin. One is don't be surprised if you hear some chickens in the background. There's nothing I can do about that. It's the new normal for living in a pandemic, right? And then the second thing is that I do want to let our participants know that there are some depictions of human skeletal remains in this slideshow. Not a lot, it's pretty subtle. You may not even notice it, but it's important for me to let you know that. Like Ariel said, I am an archaeologist and a forensic anthropologist, which means I am an expert in the search, the recovery, the analysis, and the identification of human skeletal remains. And I've been with the DPAA for almost 16 years now. Now, what is the DPAA? The DPAA is an organization with the Department of Defense. Our mission is pretty simple in principle, but very complex in action. It's what we try to do is we do global operations to seek, to recover, and to identify the human remains of our missing US servicemen from our past conflicts and our past wars, bring them back to their families to get them a proper burial. Our mission extends primarily World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, obviously, and the Cold War, and a lot of the smaller actions in the middle as well. On record right now, we've got 81,832 US military personnel that are still unaccounted for. That's a pretty daunting number. About half of those are in deep water losses, but that's 81,832. The agency, the DPAA, has approximately 700 people in the agency. About 2/3 are civilian, and maybe 1/3 is military personnel from all four branches of the military. We're a joint agency. And our headquarters is in Washington, D.C., but the majority of our employees work in Hawaii, in Honolulu, Hawaii, on Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam. We also have a laboratory in Omaha, Nebraska, and a small laboratory in Dayton, Ohio. And we have many personnel that are stationed in detachments around the world. I represent the laboratory. The laboratory is the scientific heart of the agency, and the photo that you see now is the lobby to that laboratory. We have about 150 forensic scientists just in the laboratory out of the 700 in our agency. And our laboratory includes not just archaeologists, but forensic anthropologists, forensic dentists, and chemists, and other types of technical experts. Now, the 81,832 are, when we say individual cases, we mean individual people who are missing. Each one of those is one case that we treat with a tremendous amount of respect. So we're basically forensic detectives. Each one of those cases goes through an extensive amount of research at the desk, and then recovery of evidence. And all the evidence that we recover in the field is brought back to our laboratories and analyzed in our laboratories the same way as you would forensically analyze evidence from a modern day forensic crime scene. The first laboratory that we have dedicated entirely to this mission was established in 1947, so we are not a young organization as a laboratory. The actual DPAA and our predecessor organizations has been around for about 30 years. You might recognize the acronyms, the SILHI, the Joint Task Force Full Accounting, the JPAC, the Joint POW MI Accounting Agency, and then we rebranded in 2015 to become the DPAA. Now, a lot of the desk research that we do for each individual that's missing, for each case, is done at the desk, is done first in the home station. There's a lot of archives that we look at, military records, search and recovery reports after the incident, historical documents. We go to NARA a lot. NARA is a National Archives Records Administration. We also look at the internet a lot. The internet has now become quite a resource of information that we didn't know about before. So we do all that at the desk. And then at some point, you exhaust it. You exhaust the possibility of everything you can learn at your desk, on your computer, or going to the archives. So eventually, at some point, you have to get on a plane and you have to fly to the other country. You have to talk to the locals. That's what we call field investigation. We do, we'll canvass the local villagers. We'll narrow down an area of where we need to go to. We'll talk to the elders of whatever village that we go to. We interview locals, informants, witnesses that we can find. So it's quite an extensive process for us to go through. And then if we're able to get that far and find a location for us to excavate, then we conduct recovery operations. Some excavations can be very small. They could be the size of a shoebox. Some excavations can be very big. They could be the size of a football pitch, if not bigger. And some could be very, very complex. This is what we call archaeology. This is what we call earth moving on the large level. Every single one of our excavations is led by a laboratory professional archaeologist, regardless of where we go in the field. This is just to give you this is not a complete list. This is just to get a good idea of all the countries that we work in right now. So when we say global, we mean global. Now, I haven't gone to all these countries, but I've gone to a fair amount of them in service to this job. So we definitely have been around the world quite a bit. Now, specifically Vietnam. Now, starting until at the end of the war, in 1975, the efforts began to find our missing U.S. service personnel almost immediately after. But it wasn't until 1992 that full-scale recovery efforts began at that time. Now, specifically from the Vietnam War, we've got 1,500 U.S. servicemen still missing from the war. Specifically in the country of Vietnam, it's 1,156. The rest are Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. Since 1992, when we say full-scale recovery efforts, we've conducted 140 what we call joint field activities. Sometimes we call these missions. But these joint field activities are approximately 45 days long, give or take a week. It could be 1 week shorter, 1 week longer. And we send teams of personnel 4 times a year. So we do this approximately 4 times a year, 45 days each time. And we'll send a team of personnel, mostly military, but also lots of civilians. There could be 1 team, there could be 5 teams. But we'll send, for example, 5 teams, and we'll send 4 teams to go do excavations. Each team has got 10, 12 people to do excavations on 4 different sites. And maybe 1 team goes and does investigations and canvassing and interview. Each one of these recoveries has a civilian professional archaeologist that leads the team. We also have a permanent detachment of personnel in Hanoi. These are DPA employees that live full-time, year-round, both military and civilian in Hanoi to help us support the mission as well. Now, logistics in Vietnam. Those of you who have been very lucky to go to Vietnam, can be very challenging. sometimes it's not easy. And now, if you're very lucky, you can get we can go to a place like Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, in one of the big cities, or even some of the medium ones like Dong Hoi, or if you're very lucky, Nha Trang, right? But most of the time, it's not in one of these big cities. It's in a site that looks like what it looks like in this photograph, very mountainous, or in the jungles, or on the side of a mountain in the karst or the Marble Mountains of Da Nang. Those can be very challenging. And then there's the actual logistics of the excavation. Like I said, some can be very small and some can be very large. But the very large ones can be very large, not just in scale, in size, but in resources as well. This particular photo was taken in the middle of the city of Vinh in Nha An province. And it was an excavation of an F-4 aircraft. The F-4 aircraft is in this photo. You just can't see it because it's underneath that pile of mud. Eventually, the team was able to get all the way down to the bottom, find the cockpit, find the remains of the pilot, and he was eventually identified. But from this photo, you can see that a lot of these excavations require a massive feat of engineering. Now imagine that in the jungles of the Central Highlands. And imagine that, and at the same time, you're trying to do the highest levels of quality science and forensic science that you can. I've been to Vietnam numerous times. I want to say almost a dozen times for these operations of ours. I've excavated sites. I've spent a lot of time in Quang Tri province and Khe Sanh, also Dong Ha. I've been to Vung Tau, and most recently Ha Tin, excavating a site in a rice paddy in Ha Tin. Now, there's two groups of people who we cannot do this job without. Absolutely cannot do this job without. The first is the VNO SMP. This is the Vietnamese Office Seeking Missing Persons, or VNO, we call them for short. But the VNO SMP are central government officials that we rely on, that provide us a tremendous amount of support for our operations there. The obvious reason is because we need the central government permission to do what we do, to bring in military assets to do what we do. And we also need central government buy-in on the mission that we're doing. They have to believe in what we're doing as much as we do for it to actually work. But not just because of that, there's the basics of logistics. The VNO SMP are the movers and shakers, and they really help us get things done when we need things to happen. To get to the top of that mountain, I need a helicopter. And so the VNO SMP can get me a helicopter to go to the top, or to sling load equipment to the top of that mountain. The second group of people that we can't do this job without are, of course, the locals, the local people of Vietnam, the local villagers that in the village that we currently stay in for those 45 days, or the villagers that we hire to work on the sites. Not just for the obvious labor factor of it. If we're moving a lot of earth, we need people to help us move buckets and equipment. There's that obvious part of it, but it's not just because of the labor. It's because of the knowledge base that the local villagers have, the knowledge of the mountains, knowledge of the weather, the knowledge of how the rains come in and wash the soil, which can affect the site that we're looking for evidence from. They know these details. But the locals also provide us with a lot of information about the actual losses that we're looking for. Some of these folks actually even fought in the wars. Now, a lot of times they'll look at us and think that we dress a little bit differently, we eat a lot differently, we're very different, but we're not. When we actually explain to them our mission, that we're trying to find the remains of someone missing, bring them back to their family so that both of them, both the person who died and their families, can find peace, they get it. We look right into each other's eyes and they get the mission. And that's important because they want to help. And what they do is they sometimes offer us what's called a unilateral turnover of evidence. They give us remains that they think may be of our pilot. In fact, many of our identifications come from these unilateral turnovers. And then when we do recover remains, we do what's called a joint forensic review. As you can see here, the VNO SMP scientists and our scientists will look at evidence together and look at human remains together, because what we don't want is for remains that might be Vietnamese to go out of the country. That's not the mission. The mission is to find Americans. And so we work together to decide whether or not those remains found should come home. If they do, we'll transport them back on a flag draped transfer case in what's called a dignified transfer. We don't call this a repatriation because we don't know who's in the box. we won't know that until we do extensive laboratory DNA testing. So we don't call this a repay, we'll call this a dignified transfer. So I will finish up on this last slide with 3 of my favorite photos ever taken that I ever took in Vietnam, especially the one on the bottom right with the little girl wearing the orange shirt. The way ahead is that we do still have 1,156 people still missing from, unaccounted for from Vietnam from this war. All the easy sites are done. Those have already been excavated. All we have left are either extremely difficult sites, extremely physically difficult, difficult to get to, or sites or cases that have no sites. The leads are cold. We don't know where to look. And so all the easy ones are done. It's also complicated by the fact that a lot of our informants and our witnesses are not young. And so a lot of the information is getting lost very quickly as they pass on. It's also complicated because there's a lot of infrastructure being, a lot of growth in Vietnam. And this is a good thing for Vietnam, but this may not be a good thing for some excavation sites because some sites may have a road built on top of it, or a building or a mall built on top of it. But what is good is that through the time that I've been here, the cooperation and the support that we've been getting from the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese government has improved tremendously. And that's a good thing as we go forward on this mission. So if we're talking about reconciliation, reconciliation is not done with large scale one-time events. It's done with small scale person-to-person interactions, which we do on our missions every day. So I'll wrap up there and I will see you after Phan's talk.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. To. And now I would like to turn to our next guest speaker in Singapore. Phan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ariel. I will try to share my PowerPoint. All right. Thank you, Dr. To, for a very insightful presentation. And for my part, I'll be talking about Agent Orange, the most visible legacy of the Vietnam War, and an issue that deserves more attention. For my presentation, I will provide you with an overview of Agent Orange, Dioxin, some of my research findings, and the lessons from US-Vietnam cooperation on Agent Orange. Since my background is in international relations studies, I will analyze the issue from an academic perspective, but I have made sure that the content of my presentation is not too theory-oriented and can inform US-Vietnam reconciliation efforts. Let's start with some basic facts. From 1961 until 1971, the US Air Force sprayed approximately 45 million liters or 12 million gallons of the herbicide Agent Orange, over 15% of the area of southern Vietnam. The purpose was to destroy forest cover and supplies of Vietnamese forces. Agent Orange contains dioxin, one of the most toxic chemical substances known to humankind. Over the years, dioxin residues have dissipated. Today, the most contaminated areas are former American bases in Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and Phu Cat, where Agent Orange was stored. The environmental and health effects of dioxin are extremely serious. Some of the negative impacts to the environment are deforestation, loss of biodiversity and usable cropland, and contamination of the food chain in the hotspots. It is helpful to distinguish between health issues linked to direct exposure and those associated with indirect exposure. Direct exposure to dioxin can cause several types of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and others. Indirect exposure refers to the transgenerational transmission of the health effects. The offsprings of those exposed to dioxin can experience dioxin-related illness or disabilities. We can see that the Agent Orange legacy in Vietnam is an ongoing tragedy that requires environmental remediation and health and disability assistance to the millions of affected individuals, including children. So what has the United States done to rectify the use of Agent Orange? I would like to explain this using the findings of my research, which examines US actions through the lens of reparative justice, a key concept in the studies of post-war reconciliation among former enemies. The term refers to mechanisms that seek to recognize victims as right holders, to address the consequences as well as the causes of past wrongdoing. There are two components of reparative justice. The first one is material reparations. For example, compensation, funds, and development programs in places suffering from injustice. The second aspect is symbolic reparations. This would be a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, official apologies, and monuments commemorating the victims. I characterize US response since 2007 as a combination of de facto material reparations and ambiguous symbolic reparations. First, let's look at the material aspect. The United States appropriates annual funds for Agent Orange assistance in Vietnam. By 2020, the total amount is $332.8 million US dollars, with 75% for environmental cleanup and 25% for disability assistance. Regarding dioxin remediation, decontamination work in Phu Cat and Da Nang is completed. Remediation work in Bien Hoa is underway. Washington has allocated 300 million US dollars for this project, and it is expected to complete by 2030. US aid has been utilizing the funds to deliver disability services and provide training for health workers to assist persons with severe disabilities living in provinces sprayed with Agent Orange. Last year, US aid and the Vietnamese Ministry of National Defense signed a 5-year memorandum of intent that committed 65 million US dollars for disabilities assistance. Note that these programs are not official reparations. They are referred to as humanitarian assistance. Nonetheless, they have helped improve the lives of tens of thousands of affected individuals. Moving on to the symbolic aspect. There has been no official admission of responsibility or formal apologies. US leaders avoid drawing direct causation between dioxin and the health effects seen in Vietnam. However, individual politicians have expressed that the United States has a moral obligation to help Vietnam to recover from this tragedy. 13 years of US Agent Orange assistance to Vietnam showcase this sentiment. Now, some people would say that the current approach does not ensure reparative justice in the fullest sense. And this is a fair assessment, but we should not take for granted the current progress. It is important to remember that since the end of the Vietnam War in 1975 until 2007, that's more than 3 decades, and years after normalization in 1995, there was no US provision of reparative justice for Vietnamese Agent Orange victims. During this period, the issue was highly contentious, and the two sides couldn't agree on how to deal with it. So what ended this deadlock? There are several factors, but I want to focus on one key factor, that is the contributions from civil society. During early discussions, the United States insisted that there wasn't sufficient scientific evidence to claim that Agent Orange was responsible for birth defects in Vietnam. Many people consider it an unsolvable problem due to the magnitude of the impact, the political sensitivities surrounding the deployment of the herbicides. The cost of reparative justice seemed too high for the United States. The breakthroughs finally occurred in 2006 and 2007, when convincing scientific evidence and initiatives by NGOs led the United States to come to grips with the tragedy caused by Agent Orange in Vietnam. In 2006, the Vietnamese Ministry of Health, in cooperation with Hatfield Consultants, a Canadian environmental firm, published scientific findings which identified dioxin hotspots at former US bases. Both Vietnam and the United States accepted the findings. Senator Patrick Leahy, a long-term and influential voice in the US Congress, used the findings to push for Agent Orange assistance to Vietnam. At the same time, there was increased evidence of dioxin-induced severe disabilities. Surveys conducted in Da Nang in 2007 suggest that most victims suffer from mobility impairment and mental disabilities. These findings reinforce previous scientific conclusions by Vietnamese scientists. A leading American philanthropy, Ford Foundation, played a critical role in mobilizing American public opinion and US actions. They funded several studies on hotspots and disabilities in Vietnam, not only scientific research, but they also provided grants for dioxin remediation projects and projects on best practices for disability services. Ford Foundation mobilized American and international NGOs and UN agencies to work on their projects. These initiatives garner attention from the media and encourage the US Congress to channel money to US aid and require the organization to use it in Vietnam. In 2007, Ford Foundation helped establish the US-Vietnam Dialogue Group on Agent Orange and Dioxin. Significant contributions from non-government players moved the reconciliation process forward. Following former President Bush's 2006 visit to Hanoi, the two governments recognized for the first time at the top level the need to jointly address the effects of dioxin in Vietnam. The US Congress appropriated the first fund for Agent Orange assistance in Vietnam in 2007. This marked the beginning of US provision of reparative justice, as I have explained previously. Now, there are some key takeaways from this story of reconciliation. And what I want to underscore is the role of civil society in bridging differences between the two former enemies. Scientists, doctors, NGOs debunk the narrative that there isn't a clear causal link between dioxin and disabilities in Vietnam. They demonstrated to both governments that it is possible to move beyond political obstacles to pursue a practical solution, and that the cost of reparative justice are manageable. Their work helped us understand more about the needs of the victims, thus giving the victims a voice in the reconciliation process. Discussion on addressing Agent Orange is now a key feature in bilateral defense dialogue and has become less controversial in recent years. Much more action is required to further promote reparative justice. Some victims believe that the United States is not doing enough. Time is running out for many older victims, and many children with disabilities are not receiving sufficient support. More funding needs to be allocated so that more victims can be reached. Since most affected individuals live in poorer areas in Vietnam and suffer from severe disabilities, assistance must focus on financial empowerment and local social services. Strong public-private partnership is key in this regard. Joint scientific studies can help us understand more about the long-term health effects of dioxin and what more we can do to reduce the damages. Symbolic gestures, such as US politicians visiting Agent Orange victims, will promote symbolic justice and demonstrate US acknowledgement of moral responsibility in helping the victims. Most importantly, since the goal of reparative justice is to ensure that the victims' needs and concerns are fully addressed, both governments need to engage in direct dialogue with the victims and try to understand their perspective. As we celebrate the 25th anniversary of Vietnam-US diplomatic ties, we should also celebrate the remarkable progress in Agent Orange cooperation. Further collaboration will build long-term trust and confidence between the two countries. It will also promote a genuine relationship between our people. I would like to end my presentation with a quote from Senator Patrick Leahy when he reflected upon US-Vietnam cooperation on war legacies. We have come a long way. We have further to go. Thank you.
Thank you to both of our speakers for these really very moving presentations. Before turning to our audience for their questions and comments, I will review our protocol. The instructions for Q&A should flash on your screen right now. To ask a live question or to comment, please use the raise hand function located on the participants tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please wait to be called and unmuted by a Pacific Forum staff member before speaking. Please state your name, position, and affiliation before commenting or asking questions. Alternatively, if you're not in a great spot to ask your question live, you can post your question in the Q&A tab, but if you do so, please remember to include your name and affiliation there as well. In the interest of time, please make your contributions concise so we can get to as many of them as possible. So to jumpstart our conversation, I would like to throw out the first question, and this is addressed to both Dr. To and to Phan. Considering that we are moving further away from the Vietnam War, almost 4 decades removed, and or over 4 decades removed, and a lot of your work is time sensitive, as you have both mentioned in your presentations. I wanted to ask what sort of education and outreach efforts in your lines of work do each of you see as carrying out to inform next generations in both Vietnam and the US of the horrors of war and why we should be working cooperatively together. If either of you has a response, feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, that's a good question to start off with, because things are time sensitive for the DPAA. And because if we look at the time now, 1975 is when the war ended. Anybody who is 50 or less, 47 or less was not alive at the time of the war. So if you were alive at the time of war, you're at least 50. If you fought in the war, you're at least 60. If you are, and that's if you weren't a child. If you fought as an adult, you're at least 70. You're at least 65 or 70. And if you were in the service as a career serviceman, you're at least 80, 90. And so that's definitely a time-sensitive issue for the DPAA. Now, in terms of getting information out and expressing to the younger generation what's going on, as much as I hate the kids always on the internet is a very powerful medium. The fact that we're having this conversation virtually now around the world is a powerful, powerful medium. And so there's definitely a benefit to using the advantages of social media and the technology that we have now to have this conversation, to push forward, even in the wake of a pandemic that's going on. It would have been perfectly acceptable for us to say, oh, these Pacific forums, we can take a rest this year because of the pandemic. But the fact that we embrace it and say, no, this is an important issue that we're going to go forward with. And so all the problems and all the hurdles and obstacles that we have, we can say, oh, well, let's just take a break from that this year. Or we can say, no, let's go around it, let's fix it, and let's take it head on. And so tapping into social media, tapping into the younger generation is one way to do it. But expressing also the importance of what we're doing with the work that the DPA does and the work that Phan's doing as well, and explaining to the younger generation, if you forget the past, you're going to repeat it. You're bound to repeat it. And so that is a lesson that it's not just a cliche, it's true and it's valid. And I think the lessons that we're learning now because of this pandemic is very similar to the lessons that we learned in the past, having previous pandemics. So the lessons that we're learning today from conflicts around the world are lessons that we're learning from the Vietnam War. And I think tapping into that and explaining to the younger generation, just because you're 12 doesn't mean that what happened to grandpa can't necessarily happen to you. It's different time frame, but it could be the same experiences.
Thanks for that, Dr. To. Phan, do you have a response?
Yes. Well, for me, with my academic capacity, I've been trying to conduct research on this topic, right? And one of the reasons why I was motivated to do this is because I identify a research gap in the literature. Right? People talk a lot about, for example, Japanese reconciliation with Asian countries or German reconciliation in Europe, right? But I couldn't find any comprehensive studies on how the United States has tried to promote reparative justice in Vietnam. So I've been trying to write about this, and it is a really complicated issue because it involves the scientific aspect of Agent Orange, right? It involves the health aspect. It also involves political issues and also humanitarian issues. So I'm trying my best to have a firm grasp on what is happening. I've been trying to talk to some of the people involved in the reconciliation process, people who have been working with the victims, and really try to understand what is happening and how we can improve the current approach. So, and also this is a great opportunity, and I hope that, after this session, more people will understand about this issue and why we need to do something about it, because a lot of older victims are still not receiving the support they need, and of course their offspring as well. So no, that's how I have been trying to contribute to this discussion.
Great, thank you both. So we have questions coming in through the chat, and then we also have one raised hand. So I'm going to go to our first live question. Hunter Marston, feel free to ask your question.
Yes, thanks so much for allowing me to pose a question. And thank you to the panelists for their excellent and interesting remarks. I just wanted to say that Phan Xuan Jung's remarks made me think of my favorite Vietnamese saying, Nuk Nhớ Nguyen, because I think there's certainly a historical memory and environmental components to this that require some consideration. But I wanted to ask about some of the parallel US-Vietnam aspects of the emerging partnership. And I wonder specifically, does cooperation in either Agent Orange cleanup or repatriation of remains impede or proceed independently from other more political or security-oriented aspects of the relationship? I guess what I'm wondering is, do these activities proceed better sort of separate, or do they mutually reinforce one another? Thanks.
Great question. Phan, or to Dr. To, if either of you want to respond.
I think I can answer first. Thank you, Minh, for that quote, and that's a very interesting question. In my presentation, I mentioned that even after normalization in 1995, the two sides couldn't agree on how to resolve the issue of Agent Orange because it was a very complicated and sensitive issue. There were certainly security and economic incentives for the two countries to come together and try to resolve war legacies. But I think the important point is that without knowing what is really going on in this situation, right? And I highlighted the role of civil society in presenting scientific evidence and how to best assist the victims. Without those kind of knowledge, even with a lot of political will and support, we cannot move forward. So I think that's the message I want to convey through my presentation. But then, of course, you need influential support from the government in order to get more resources and to get things done, right? I mentioned about Senator Patrick Leahy. He was very critical in pushing for the assistance the assistance to Vietnam. And so I see it as like a strong cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. And of course, the two aspects, the aspects of the war legacy and also other security and economic incentives, it reinforce each other.
Okay, Dr. To, did you have a response to Hunter Marston's question?
My audio broke up a little bit, so I missed Hunter's question. Something about security. I'm sorry about that. Can you repeat that, Hunter?
Sure, it's probably the fault of my internet here in Australia. My question is, do these activities proceed best separate from the political or diplomatic and security aspects of the US-Vietnam partnership, or are they mutually reinforcing?
I think they're mutually reinforcing. A lot of what we do does have a political aspect to it. A lot of the locations that we go to, some locations are secure locations that the Vietnam government prefers that we don't go to. Some of these locations are military installations. Some of these locations are still classified, and we respect that, and we have to respect that tremendously. We don't push. We don't pull. We only ask for support and cooperation. And we have found that that works very well. In many cases, we find a solution. We find an equitable solution because what we can provide, what we can give to the Vietnamese government and the Vietnamese people comes back for us. It's in a very altruistic way. It comes back for us because it's what we need to support to be able to find our lost colleagues and get them identified. But it can have a very heavy political aspect to it. It can depend on even down to the logistics of saying you can't be in this province right now. Is there any reason why? Yes, but that's what we need to deal with right now. And we don't ask the question. We just say, okay, we're going to go work in that province over there. And so it requires a tremendous amount of asking the question, but then respecting the answer. And so there are some security issues that are involved there, but politics always plays a heavy part of it. Now, I had the luxury of being a scientist. I have the luxury of being an archaeologist, and I have the luxury of not having to worry too much about that. I worry about the dirt and what's coming out of the ground and the evidence and processing it in forensic matter. But that's why we've got personnel in the detachments to deal with that on a full-time basis. They're the ones that liaise permanently in the country with the host nation officials.
Great, thanks for that. So we have a question that was chatted in from Erwin Tan, who is an associate professor at Hong Kong University of Foreign Studies. He has two questions here. The first is, what can or should be done with regards to issues such as war crimes against Vietnamese civilians committed by US and other combatant troops, for example, South Korean troops during the war? And his second question regards what can be done regarding the plight of Amera-Asian offspring from the war.
Okay.
And Phan?
Well, these are two difficult questions, and I don't think I can comment too much on these questions, but I would like to emphasize this point. I think without truth telling, without understanding what really happened, and without creating a shared understanding of the past, of what happened, we can never move forward in addressing war legacy. So that's what I wish to see first, is to see, first of all, more discussions on the wrongdoing that was committed by any sides during the war. Right? Who are the victims? What are the grievances? And only once we created that kind of shared understanding of history can we talk about how we can support the victim. And it's also important that the victims can have a channel to raise their voice, to talk about what happened in the war without the fear of discrimination or punishment. So I think that's two key factors in addressing war legacy that we need to focus on first.
Great, thanks. Dr. To, did you have a response?
Yeah, I want to give the speaker, the participant, credit for asking those two questions, because those are two incredibly difficult questions to find answers for. And there are no easy answers for that. It's very, very complex. And what Phan said is there does need to be more truth telling. That's a powerful phrase, truth telling. Even something as simple as sitting down, having some tea and discussing is a very powerful thing. What we encounter a lot is local villagers, informants, even witnesses, even participants of the war, of the actual loss that we're looking for. So for example, I'm looking for a very specific individual who was taken POW and then executed and buried in the ground. And we have with the help of the VNO SMP, we have found one of the officers that actually did the execution and actually buried him in the ground. Of course, that's the person that I want to talk to, because that's the person that's going to help me find the remains. And listening to his count of it is a very difficult thing to listen to, because I'm literally listening to the story of how this individual executed and buried one of the Americans who I'm trying to find. But our teams have done an excellent job of putting aside that animosity and putting aside the blame game. We don't play the blame game because that doesn't help anybody. That doesn't help the victims. That doesn't help the people who are alive today. That doesn't help the families. And so we listen to the story, we empathize with it, we listen to it compassionately, and we take what we need from the story, in my case, where the remains were buried and how he was executed and where we can find the remains, to reach the end of our mission. And we keep the goal of our mission in mind. And that seems to work very, very well. And I know that doesn't really answer your question very specifically, but the idea of discussion and talking and truth telling is definitely the beginning first steps, or not even the first steps, the necessary steps throughout the entire process to find answers for victims of war crimes and victims of Agent Orange.
Okay, thanks for that. I'm going to move to another question from Minh, who's also a member of our United States Vietnam Next Generation Leaders Initiative. And this is for Phan. And it's talking about, you address the activities of civil societies in the US and the role that they play in reconciliation efforts. And she's asking about can you give examples of civil society activities in Vietnam that are happening in parallel? And if there are none from Vietnam, who are the agencies in Vietnam contacting and working with those from the US? I know Dr. Cho mentioned VNO SMP on the government level, but perhaps if you can talk about some of the other organizations, civil society and government in Vietnam that are working on these issues. Phan.
Okay, so for civil societies in Vietnam, we have the Vietnam Association for Victims of Agent Orange, or VAVA, and we also have the Vietnam Red Cross. And so what they have been doing is trying to understand what the victims need. So they have been representing the voice. They have been the voice for the victims. And I mentioned in my presentation that there were several surveys in Da Nang in 2007, and those surveys were conducted by the VAVA. So in a way, they also help to raise awareness. They also try to identify the victimized population, and try to understand their concerns and how can not just local NGOs but also other international organizations can do to support the victims, right? In some cases, victims do need, they do have specific needs. So you need local people to talk to them and understand what are the most what are the most urgent needs. Could it be like financial support or access to disability services, right? So that's the main role of this organization, and they also try to promote symbolic justice for the victim. So they want more acknowledgement from the United States. They have been very vocal about this, that the United States need to do more to acknowledge the damages done in Vietnam with the use of Agent Orange. And then they do want to see more symbolic gestures from the United States.
Thanks. And Dr. Cho, I also wanted to go to you just on a quick take on that. Are there any other organizations that DPAA works with, maybe outside of the Vietnamese government, on their projects?
You mean specifically in Vietnam?
Yeah.
We generally don't. We generally work just with the VNO SMP. What we end up doing is we do contract out some of our work to other universities and other private CRM firms, cultural resource management firms, to sort of outsource some of our field work. And so we have had, for example, Scripps Institute here in California, at the University of Delaware. These are underwater scientists that can provide us with underwater assets at certain times of the year that maybe we can't run an operation. They will have that. We'll partner with them to go into Vietnam to conduct some of the scientific work for us, or some of the logistical work for us. But we generally we work entirely with the VNO SMP about it.
Okay, great. The next two questions are for Dr. To as well, and they're from Charles Bailey, who is the former director of the Aspen Institute. His first question is, what was DPAA's expenditure attributable to your operations in Vietnam just in 2019? So getting a hard number there. And then second, going back to kind of the issue with time sensitivity, you point out that finding remains for the remaining 1,156 Americans missing in Vietnam gets harder and harder with the passage of time. Will it ever be possible to find them all? Or will the DPAA still be working in Vietnam many decades from now?
Those are two very, very good questions. The first one's a little bit easier to answer, and that's simply because I don't have the number. I have the luxury of not having to worry about money because I'm a scientist and I have to worry about the science. But having said that, I can tell you that our expenditure in Vietnam this year, fiscal year 20, not a good year to judge anything off of, just because of the pandemic. Things went very much awry for everything because of that. Fiscal year 19, if you go back that way, I can tell you that it's definitely in the multiples of millions of each one of our operations. If we run 5 or 6 teams each time, logistically speaking, helicopter blade hours, that's not cheap for the agency to run, and we need the support to do that from the VNO SMP. And so our expenditure is in the multiples of millions for Vietnam on a yearly basis. We've got some money that we get funding. All our funding comes from, of course, Congress, and all money comes from because of the DoD budget, and that we have several amounts of money that can be earmarked for certain activities. Some monies are earmarked for this particular activity, that particular activity, but we do have money that's earmarked for Southeast Asia and specifically the Vietnam War. I can't tell you what that total is, but because I just don't know. But I do know that it is in the tens of millions, and specifically Vietnam as well. The second question is, it's easier to answer, but it's harder to answer. It's easier to answer because I can tell you that no, honestly, I don't think we're going to be able to recover all 1,156 individuals left in Vietnam. Part of it has to do with simple physics. Some remains are gone. Some remains, nature always reclaims everything. Nature always wins. And so anything that's on the side of a mountain, anything that's in the ground will eventually get turned back into dust. And so the physics part of it is that some remains are eventually going to disintegrate to the point where we cannot recover them anymore. But it's not just physics, it's also the transformation of the sites. Like I said, a lot of the growth of the infrastructure in Vietnam is a good thing for Vietnam. But the more a site is transferred, the more there's land transformation on top of it, the more the plow of an agricultural field, the more manioc that's planted on it over and over again. Every single time something happens to that location, every year, every hour, every day, it affects the potential of finding remains and the preservation factor. And so as you have more earth moving to build a gas station or a residential home or a school, that can affect the integrity of the site. But you've also got the passage of time, and we lose a lot of clues and a lot of leads. Like I said, some witnesses that we have are not young. And we are rushing as much as we can to try and talk to the villagers, find folks, find people. So if we have somebody that we think maybe we want to talk to, that person was here at the time of the war, let's go find them. We can't meet with them, and we'll have someone say, well, just come back in 6 months. We say, we don't want to come back in 6 months because he may not be around in 6 months. And so we definitely use the time sensitivity to press our work as much as possible. And that's why we work as many hour days as we possibly can here at home and in Vietnam as well. So do I think that we're going to find them all? No, I don't think so, because of those reasons, but we're not going to give up. The idea and the plan is that I'm going to be out of a job, because the idea is to identify everybody to the point where there's nobody left to identify, and I don't have a job with this agency anymore. That we want this agency to go out of business. But unfortunately, not just in Vietnam, all parts of the world, there is a realization that some folks we're just never going to be able to get to.
That's great. Thank you for that. So I don't see any more questions in the queue or raised hands, but to our audience members, please feel free, even though we're coming up close to time. Oh, I just saw one raised hand go up from Barry Vu. So Barry, let's turn it over to you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. Okay, so first, thank you first to the Pacific Forum for organizing the webinar, and also to our speakers. I would like to ask a question to both Ms. Dennis and to Dung. Since the reconciliation effort between the US and Vietnam focus on both repatriative justice for Agent Orange victim, and also for the recovery of missing in action soldiers. As Ms. Dennis just pointed out, that one day there will not be any remains, or we will not be able to recover all MIA victims. Will that be affecting the repatriative justice or in the US-Vietnam relation in any way? Because right now I think it's kind of a two-way relationship. Vietnam helps US find missing in action personnel, and the US in returns organize events and also grants to help victims of Agent Orange. So that would be my question. Will the inability to identify and recover missing in action personnel affect US-Vietnam relations? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The relations between our countries is critical for our success, and it's been we've given a lot of our success the credit because of these relations. Is the inability for us to get everybody going to affect it? I don't think so. I think if anything, it'll affect the logistics of it. I think it'll affect maybe less missions a year. If we do 4 a year, maybe we'll eventually dwindle down to 3. Maybe we'll eventually get down to 2. Eventually we'll get down to 1. And at some point in the future, our government will eventually say, maybe we've done enough. And I don't know when that's going to be. 10 years, 15 years, 300 years, I don't know. But at some point, those efforts are going to stop. And the question would be, is it going to affect the relations between US and Vietnam? I don't think so, in the sense that what we've done already has already been tremendous. And what we've done in terms of improving the relationship we have with the VNO SMP, as far as I understand, we're already talking about collaboration in other venues in other agencies, not just recovery of MIA, but using this to springboard other agencies that I don't even know about, and initiatives that I don't even know about, but they fall back on, oh, do you remember what DPA is doing with the VNO SMP? And so what we've already done in these past 20 years, 30 years has really helped the relationship to continue on to do other bigger and better things that may have nothing to do with us. And so I think, if anything, it's a positive thing that we can all be proud of, and I don't think it's going to have a negative relationship if we cease operations in Vietnam.
Yes,
Phan?
I totally agree with Dr. To, and I think that the challenges in one war legacy should not impede the progress in another. We should see these two as separate issues that both require urgent actions, and regardless of the progress of the other issues. And for the issue of Agent Orange, you can see it as a humanitarian concern, right? And the point of reparative justice is to put the victims at the center. So regardless of anything else, you should look at what the victims are saying look at their grievances and how we can cooperate together to address it. Right? So there should not be any, political obstacles, morally speaking, when it comes to helping those are being affected by Agent Orange. Yeah, and that's my comment.
Thanks. So
Thank you so much.
We are close to time, but we have one more hand raised from Charles Bailey. So Charles, we'll go to you.
Well, I wanted to thank both of you for your presentations. This was really excellent. And I learned a lot, particularly about the issue of recovering US remains. So thank you. I just want to say there's been an enormous amount of progress, and I agree with you that the progress needs to continue, but it has also permitted lots of other more, shall we say, more usual or traditional or normal things to develop at a faster rate between two former enemies than might have been the case. So I hope that it won't be too many more decades before we don't have to have a seminar on either of these subjects. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Charles. We are close to time. I wanted to turn it over to our speakers to give any last remarks that they may have before we say goodbye to our audience. So we can go to Dr. To first, and then we'll switch to Phan. So Dr. To.
Thanks, Ariel. This has been a really productive conversation, and I've learned a lot from what Phan has had to teach us, and from our participants as well, and our questions that have been asked. This is not an easy conversation to have, and what Phan said is placing victims at the center, and that's a powerful, powerful thing, because war and battle is always about politics. There's always some reason behind it. There's always some money involved, and there's always lots of economy and big picture items. But in the end, placing the victims in the middle is something that transcends the Vietnam War, transcends the Korean War, transcends all wars, because that's ultimately who we are as people. And so the reason why that's important is because everything that we do in life is about placing the mission at the center. Not necessarily the victim, but placing the mission at the center. So the example that I gave about how some villagers would look at our teams and they look at us with our video games and our boots and sneakers and eating Oreo cookies, and they'll look at us and they'll think we are so far apart. But when we actually explain to them what our mission is, and they get it and they understand it, that humanizes all of us as being human beings. And while that individual that we're looking for, that missing U.S. soldier, you may or may not describe him as a victim, his family sure is. And so trying to find answers for his family and trying to get closure. We try not to say closure too much, but because there rarely ever is closure, but trying to get answers to them and let them be at peace is a very powerful thing. And it's a very similar concept with what Phan's going through with the Agent Orange victims, is maintaining the dialogue, maintaining these discussions that we're having, and really springboarding from the positive relations that we have, not just for these two issues, but to continue on to other issues that nobody in this forum is dealing with, but can springboard off of them, that can improve relations. Just in the time that I've been with this agency, I can tell you that my personal experience, the relationships have vastly improved. From the first time I've been to Vietnam in 2005, the very first recovery I conducted in Quang Tri province, to the last time that I was there in Ha Tinh, the relations have improved, and I see the infrastructure growing in Vietnam. Vietnam is growing at an astronomical rate, and it's a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing if you grow too fast and you forget the past. Then, like I said, you're bound to repeat it, and forgetting our elders is a terrible thing. And so recognizing what has happened to the victims in the past, I think is a very humanizing thing that we can take with us from this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. To. Phan, last remark.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. To. You have put it very brilliantly. And I'm just going to say this. I think at this point, war legacies do not present an obstacle, but an opportunity to enhance bilateral relations. And it's tragic that sufferings happened during the war, and in many places it's still happening right now. And we should remember the dark history, the dark chapter in our history. But it's also very tragic if we let the past prevent us from moving forward.
Thank you to both of our speakers for a really engaging conversation. Thank you to all of our audience members for their comments and questions, and just really making this, I think, a really, as Dr. To said, a really productive dialogue. Before I give my final announcements, I would like to hand the floor over to Pacific Forum's president, Bob Guerrier, who's on the line. So Bob, if you want to go ahead and just give a few closing words.
Oh, certainly. Thanks a lot, Ariel. I'll let the director enable my video if that's possible.
Let's see. Video.
I think so.
Yep, you're on camera.
Thanks, super. Hey, folks, first of all, thank you so much for your time. Dr. To and Phan, both of you, really appreciated this exchange today. This has been a really healthy, I think, and high quality exchange. There's many sides to every contentious issue, especially war. And Dr. To, your mission with DPMA, its charge to drive, for answers, dare say closure, as you mentioned, which doesn't always happen. You worry about dirt, you said, and what comes out of the ground. I think it's an incredibly powerful truth in what that yields. It's a very pragmatic comment, but also so very eloquent. I also appreciate your reflections on some of the details. You talk about executions, and it's a grim reminder of all those details of war and the horror behind it. Phan, thank you for asking those very hard questions, regarding Agent Orange, issues of justice, because these are the legacies of war in Vietnam, and I dare say globally. It takes energy and visibility to search for these answers, and most importantly, their causes, ultimately, to try to prevent these from repeating themselves, as you both talked about. So our aim today, quite frankly, was to have a conversation and discourse. I think we achieved that, absolutely. Thank you. I learned a heck of a lot along the way. I've got to say, this is done in the spirit of young leaders. Phan, when I look at you and your youth, I'm really encouraged, Denise, as well. There's so much, and we look to the next generation. And so I'm absolutely upbeat as I look at the last hour plus of our time together. So back to you, Ariel. Thanks for moderating this absolutely wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Bob. So a couple of announcements before we close out here. So we shared earlier the registration for a separate series that we will be kicking off this Sunday in Hawaii. So we're excited to showcase the US-Singapore partnership in 2 separate discussion series. We will be launching the US-Singapore Indo-Pacific Conversation series with support from US Embassy Singapore. And in the series, senior experts will review key milestones in the relationship, discuss evolving challenges, and explore strategic imperatives and innovative policy prescriptions for further advancing US-Singapore partnership. Our first session is titled The United States and Singapore, 55 Years of Partnership, and will be this Sunday, December 13 at 4:00 p.m. Hawaii time, Monday, December 14 at 10 a.m. Singapore time. And it will feature Dr. Satu Lemay of East-West Center, Dr. Ian Chong of National University of Singapore, and Ambassador Chan Hung Chi of EC's USAC Ishak Institute. So for more information and to register, those links are in the chat box as well as on Pacific Forum's social media. So feel free to visit our Facebook or Twitter pages to sign up. And the second US-Singapore event is the US-Singapore Cyber and Tech Security Virtual Series that is also supported by the US Embassy in Singapore. It's a mix of open and closed door sessions to discuss some of the most pressing issues related to cyberspace and technology, and to improve existing Enhancing Cooperation Between the US and Singapore. We held our first session of this series on November 17th, and the next session will be held on Wednesday, December 17th at 3 p.m. Hawaii time, Thursday, December 18 at 9 a.m. Singapore time. And during this session, we will discuss Indo-Pacific perspectives on the application of international law and norms in cyberspace. If you are interested in joining us, you can find additional information on Pacific Forum's homepage or by clicking the link that is in the chat box now. So finally, please stay tuned for the 4th edition of this US-Vietnam Indo-Pacific Conversation Series that will be happening in January next year. So until next time, take care and wishing everyone a happy holiday season.
Today, I am announcing the normalization of diplomatic relationships with Vietnam.